right, everybody. I think we're good to go. Yalla. On today, we're talking about planned business analysis governance. So remember, we're still at the planning stage. Like, how are we going to plan everything that we do? So it's 3.3, which means we're still in the third chapter of all the planning that we have to do. First chapter is planning the business analysis approach. The second is planning the stakeholder engagement. And the third is the business analysis governance. Sorry, I'm from Lebanon and we don't have a government. So it's probably an unconscious thing. Oh, anyways. The fourth is plan business analysis information management. And the fifth is identify business analysis performance and improvements. So the fifth is how do you basically plan your own intuitive approach and how you structure basically things. So as natural, it's the same order of everything. There's a purpose for them. There's a description of what it means and what we use it for. There's our inputs that would be required. There's a little chart that we like to go around, and there are the elements of it. And then after that, there's basically the guidelines and tools, techniques, stakeholders, and outputs. It kind of goes around in circles. I'm not gonna lie. Like almost all of them kind of sound the same, start sounding the same after a while, which means we're actually learning the fundamentals. So bear with me. So the purpose of planning business analysis governance is to define how decisions are made about requirements and designs, including reviews, change controls, approvals, and prioritizations. So basically how we make decisions. And think about it literally as a template that you create in order for every single thing that you are actually interacting with to be referenced by a baseline. Naturally, in business analysis, even that fucking baseline should be questioned and altered as you go through the project. So you're doing great, but at the very least, we create a certain setup in order for us to see how we make decisions, and throughout we iterate and see if we're making decisions in the right way or not. Description. Business analysis ensures that a governance process is in place and clarify any ambiguities within it. So as a business analyst, you're supposed to tell them how you're going to do things, write down how you're going to do things, and clarify. And again, clarification, like here, is clarify any ambiguities within it, which literally translates to you explaining in deeper meaning why you're making these decisions or why you're approaching decisions in that way, which allows you to structure your approach and clarify your approach to yourself. And that's honestly, guys, that's how intuition is built. Like the more in detail you actually dive into something, the more intuitive it becomes how you do it. So a governance process identifies the decision makers, the processes, the information required for decisions to be made. Remember, you're working with stakeholders, you're working with different stakeholders, you're working with a certain branch of a business somewhere, or a business in general that has many branches, and the information required to be made. So it's like, what are you going to use? How are you going to use it? When are you going to use it? What's relevant to actually, you can get information from anywhere, but sometimes it's not really the relevant information. So, or the relevant people. That's what we discussed in the previous one, the stakeholder engagement. So a governance process describes how approvals and prioritization decisions are made for requirements and designs. Simple. When planning the governance approach, business analysts identify how business analysis work will be approached and prioritized. So basically, how the work will be approached and prioritized is part of this kind of planning. What is the process for proposing a change in business analysis information is. So you're kind of explaining. They kind of sound redundant, man. What the process for proposing a change to business analysis information is. So remember, right now we're not into the business analysis information planning, but the process to create the business information plan is kind of planned here in this stage, because you kind of have to think of okay, so we are already thinking of where to get the information, and then in the business information analysis information management plan, that's when you plan the information and where it fits in all this stuff. Who has the authority and responsibility to propose changes and who should be involved in the change discussions? While doing stakeholder engagement and planning for them, that's probably like a thing as well that you would be considering. So basically they feed into each other, right? Who has responsibility for analyzing change requests? You kind of like give tasks to team people, to like key personnel that actually like look at you and go like, okay, this is it, this is it, this needs changing, this needs to be moved differently, this needs to be placed here. And who has the authority to approve changes? Again, like you're practically designing the hierarchy of your actual approach, assuming that you're working within a team, or assuming at the very least you have people working with you on it, whether it is a team of business analysts on your side or just like people from within the company that are working. And how changes will be documented and communicated. Basically, like really just highlighting how things could be done or should be done or like will be done. What are the inputs? Yay! Business analysis approach. Incorporating the overall business analysis approach into the governance approach is necessary to ensure consistency across the approaches. So yeah, incorporating and documenting the approach is actually like relevant. Stakeholder engagement approach. Get it? Because we literally have to like go through all that, like every single thing that we do matters and supports an input in somewhere, and its output supports an input somewhere else. Because every one of these stages has an end result, which is a plan of some sort. And these things that we like figure out as we're creating the plan are basically like, I don't know if I want to use the word, I'd rather use the word fornicating with each other in order to create new things. And these new things are basically going to fornicate with other things in order to create more things. I would want to use interact or integrate, but these words are too business analysis. So, identifying stakeholders and understanding their communication and collaboration needs is useful to determining their participation. So that's the stakeholder plan at the beginning is actually what's important because you actually can identify using these. And then basically, like the engagement approach may be updated based on the completion of the governance approach. So ultimately, like, everything that completes supports something else to be completed. And as something else is completed, we could go back to what we used to complete it, and we can double check or do something like this. Yay, we have a chart. So the governance input output diagram. The two inputs are the business analysis approach and the stakeholder engagement approach. And they're inputted into the business analysis government, which gives us the guidelines and tools, which we're going to be checking in a bit, are basically the performance assessment, business policies, current state description, get it, guidelines and tools like business policies of the actual business, or forgetting the ethics because like that's a must or that's the base. The business policies are basically like the company policy, how the company does things. You cannot fuck with the culture of the company just because whatever, right? Like you have to cater to these things. You have to cater to like stakeholders. You have to cater to the cultural existence of these people. Business analysis, performance assessment, current state description, as in like basically like where we are and the position that we're in and how are we going to move forward from here. I'm assuming that's it. Legal regulatory information, if there are like things from the outside world that are basically going to add constraints to our movement, because the last thing you want is to create a full project without actually like it being applicable, right? And so like once we actually finish the governance, the output is the governance approach, which is basically, and it's used. This output is going to be used in the business analysis information management, which is basically right after this, and assess requirements changes, approve requirements, and prioritize requirements. So these are 5.3, 5.4, 5.5. So there are in a couple of chapters into the future. The elements, decision making. The decisions are made throughout the initiative. A stakeholder may serve in various roles in decision making process, such as participant in decision making discussions, subject matter experts, right? Like, who are the people that are going to be making decisions? How are we going to be making decisions through them, with them? How are we going to utilize them? Whoever reviews the information and whoever approves the decision, managements, stakeholders, all the good stuff. Decision-making process defines what happens when teams cannot reach consensus, right? So like, it's like the protocol that will be used in order for us to kind of like properly do the business analysis that's required. By identifying escalation paths and key stakeholders who hold final decision-making authority. Great. The change control process. When business analysts develop a change control process, they get it like these two basically, the decision making and change control process are two things that have to be implemented, that have to be created. So this plan is considered a full plan. For our outputs from this kind of planning, these things are required. So determine the process of requesting changes, specify which requirements and designs the change control process covers, and determine whether it applies to all changes or only to changes of a specific size, cost, or level of effort. So like you have to, part of the change process is determining why it makes sense. Like how do we actually like ask for change? What's the proper like channel? Who are the proper people that would actually approve of this, say no to it, guide us through it, support us with it? And this process details the steps of proposing a change when changes can be proposed, who can propose changes, and how change requests are communicated. Determine the elements of the change request. Identify the information to be included in a proposal to support decision making and implementation if it's approved. Possible components to consider on the change requests are. So determining the elements of the change request is basically how to identify the information and where it comes from. It's really just like them diving deeper and explaining to us the same thing in different angles in order for our mind to kind of like completely understand that there's always something that contributes to something else, and we have to be on point when we're picking what contributes to who and what and where and all this stuff. Cost and time estimates for each area affected by the proposed change. The expected cost of change is estimated. Benefits and explanation of how the change aligns with the initiative. Like we have to say, like we have to describe why this change makes sense, right? So the cost and estimates of this change are basically logistics about it. The benefits, basically like what are we actually getting out of it and why it's a good change. The risks, naturally, because any an analysis of risks to the initiative, the solution, or the business objectives, we have to tell them like this change would actually impact something in this kind of way. It could be considered a risk. It could be not, depending on the actual policy around risk that the company has or the business you're interacting with. Priority, because some changes take precedence over others. The level of importance of the change relative to the other factors such as organizational objectives, regulatory compliance, requirements, and stakeholder needs. And course of action. Course of action for the change includes an assessment of the components of the change request, basically cost, time, benefits, risk, and priority. And so these basically are like how we're going to implement the change and what are we doing about it. Including as recommended by the requester, like naturally stakeholders as well have some say in things because they might want things to be done a certain kind of way, and that's basically it. Determine how changes will be prioritized. The priority of the proposed change is established relative to other competing interests within the current initiative. All right, how will we prioritize? And we look at different interests and what else we have to do and change and how will we affect these change, how changes will be documented, configuration management and traceability. Like, naturally, we want people to be able to like move with us as we actually do things. We don't, last thing we want is to kind of like, there has to be a process for others to follow along. Determine how changes will be communicated. Methodology of how proposed changes under review, approved, declined, deferred, changes will be communicated to stakeholders. Like you're not only communicating with one side, like these changes are going to affect a whole lot of different parts of the system or like whatever it is you're working on. So you have to basically accrue the yes from all of them or just kind of be able to like send them the information they need. Determine who will perform the impact analysis, specify who is responsible for performing an analysis on the impacts and proposed change will have across the initiative. Like here, you actually have to kind of like delegate, like this is what's going to be impacted, who will be doing the analysis for the impact. It could be someone from your side or it could be somebody from the other side. Who the fuck knows, man? But like every project really has its own kind of like setup. So it's figure outable. Determine who will authorize changes, include a designation of who can approve changes and what business analysis information their authority covers. Again, like, that's something you have to clarify from the beginning because the last thing you want is to basically be reliant on somebody that can authorize stuff, but the truth is they don't have the authority to. So yeah, things get fucked up. Timelines, expected value, dependencies, resource constraints, adopted methodologies. The other factors influence how requirements and designs are prioritized. So that's basically us planning the prioritization approach, right? So when planning the prioritization process, Business analysts determine the formality and rigor of the prioritization process. Uh, yeah, some processes require a lot more intensity, they require a lot more people on it, and sometimes they just need to be triple checked, double checked, 500 times checked. You get to decide, man. Participants who will be involved in prioritization, as in like you picking the team members and all that shit. Process for deciding how prioritization will occur, including which prioritization techniques will be utilized. That's actually something intense because like you kind of have to lay down everything that you want to do, and then you have to weigh them, and then how to prioritize them is basically a plan in its own that needs to kind of like support. So here the groundwork is like is where the intensity is. Like the process for deciding how prioritization will occur is genuinely either pre-decided by previous case studies or something like this that you can use tools and shit like this. I'm sure we're going to read about it in the tools down low. I'm sure we're going to read about it. Or it's just going to be something that you have to kind of like get enough information around in order to figure it out. So yeah, criteria to be used for prioritization, for example, requirements may be prioritized based on cost, risk, and value, depending on the project, depending on stakeholders, depending on the actual policies of the company. All these are actually like valid ways for you to kind of like decide how to prioritize. So the approach should also determine which stakeholders will have a role in prioritization. Great. A plan for approvals. Great. Plan for approvals formalizes the agreement between all stakeholders at the current and the presentation for the requirements and designs an accurate, adequate, and contains sufficient detail to allow for continued progress to be made. This is you basically creating that we entered into the whole bureaucratic life and bureaucratic world. Love you, man. My cat is asking for attention. So here, what's going on basically is you're creating the system that kind of like has people moving back and forth that allows for seamless approvals. Specifically because most stakeholders you will work with have their own job to do. So like, how will they actually receive what they need to approve of? How would it be explained and all that shit. The timing and frequency of approvals are dependent on the size and complexity of the change and associated risk for foregoing or delaying an approval. Naturally, business analysts must determine the type of requirements and designs to be approved. Okay, the timing for approvals, the process to follow and gain approval of who will approve requirements, going back to stakeholders and designs. When planning the appropriate approval process, business analysts consider the organizational culture. Ah, I knew it. And the type of information being approved, naturally. For example, new systems or processes are highly regulated industries such as financial, pharmaceutical, or healthcare are likely to require frequent and rigorous review and approval of very detailed specifications for other types of initiatives. A less intense approval process may be more appropriate and result in a faster implementation. Yeah, unless for other types of initiatives, you would not necessarily need that much. It's literally government, right? When you're working with government, it's constraints over constraints. And they mentioned literally like healthcare, pharmaceutical, and like financial. These are three of the worst kind of like businesses to kind of like work with because they're trying their best to kind of like get things done with whatever they're forced to have. Planning for approvals also includes the schedule of events where approvals will occur and how they will be tracked. Stakeholder availability, attitude, and willingness to engage determine the efficiency of the approval process and may significantly affect delivery timelines. That's it. That's it. Be careful. Guidelines and tools. Business analysis performance assessment provides results of previous assessments that should be reviewed and incorporated into all planning approaches. Amazing. Always look, and our research should always be like, has this been done before, and how can we apply what they succeeded in, and how can we not do what they failed in? Business policies define that it limits the policies of the business. They define the limits on which the decisions must be made. They may be described as by regulations, contracts, agreements, warranties, certifications. Contracts. Uh, they might actually like you always consider outside external factors because like maybe we have a certain contract with some supplier or some like basically person that's buying our shit that we can't fuck with and our change might actually like involve itself in it, so who knows. All of these should be considered. Yeah. Current state description provides the context within which the work needs to be completed, as in like, where we are and how are we probably going to be completing it. This information can help drive how to make better decisions, naturally. Legal regulatory information describes legislative rules or regulations that must be followed and can be used to help develop a framework that ensures sound business decision making. Great. Techniques, brainstorming. It's a technique, right? Sit with people and just talk about shits. Used to generate an initial list of potential stakeholder names who may need approval roles and defined governance process. Right, because we're planning analysis governance. Approvals, man. Can I do my job? Oh, I believe in you. Go for it. Spot on. Do it, sport. Sorry, man. I lived my 90s watching TV because we didn't really have the best of household. Document analysis, used to evaluate existing governance processes or templates. Interviews, basically possible decision making, change control approval, or prioritization approaches, and participants with individual small group, like actually like get information from them. Item tracking, to track any issues will arise when planning a governance approach, to see how this issue basically like manifests itself and spreads through the actual like, I don't want to say the process, because the process created that issue, but it might bite us back because if we don't notice things that we're kind of like creating, like after a couple of weeks, you come back to a stakeholder that's disgruntled, you're gonna get screwed basically because shit that you expected from them isn't done. So like, yeah, lessons learned naturally used to find past initiatives, identified values, experiences with governance that can be leveraged in current or future initiatives. Organizational modeling used to understand roles, responsibilities within the organization in an effort to define governance approach that involves the right stakeholders. Process modeling used to document the process or method of governance, of governing business analysis, like what is what's the process that we're using or the model that we're using for the process. Reviews, naturally, we go to people and be like, how are we doing so far? Survey or questionnaire used to identify possible decision-making, change control approval, or prioritization approaches and participants. Workshops, possible decision-making, change control approval, prioritization approaches, and participants with team setting. Like all of them are valid, but each one kind of like might require something else. Sometimes you kind of want a team effort. Sometimes you want to take them individually. And sometimes you look them in the face, be like, tell me how I'm fucking up, or why are you pissed at me, mofo? Stakeholders. Who are the potential stakeholders in this? The main subject matter experts, all right. Project managers, of course, and regulators. Makes sense. Sponsors. They are the same stakeholders in every single aspect. Why? Because they don't specify anything here. What's the domain subject matter? Maybe a possible source of requested change or maybe identified as needing to be involved in change decisions. It kind of feels like, it's the same people or it's the same kind of like once you're extending into like the information field and you're trying to get all these people to kind of like give you a clue of what you might do in order for you to do some to get things done better. It's the same people but approached in different ways because once you're planning analysis governance, you're talking to them about different things than if you're just planning with them stakeholder engagement or just kind of like planning the business analysis approach. And again, like sponsors impose their own requirements. What are the outputs? Governance approach identifies the stakeholders who will have the responsibility and authority to make decisions. All right. So the output of this is basically just the people who are going to be relied upon for any form of influence slash change about the business analysis work, including who will be responsible for setting priorities and who will approve changes to business analysis information. It also defines the process that will be utilized to manage requirement and design changes across the initiative. And here you go, man. We just finished how to plan business analysis governance. Fucking love you guys. I really hope some of you are actually watching this. Peace. Next chapter is business analysis information management.